Thank you. So I am hoping that you will leave here having learned something. It was very hard when I was planning this talk to know exactly what level of detail the audience I'm speaking to would have on factory farming. So I apologize if I'm telling you a lot of things you already know, but hopefully some of this will be new and useful. So I started with animal equality back in January, and I was really fortunate to start when they're launching the virtual reality project, iAnimal, transporting people inside these places that I've been in so many times. And every time you go in, you just think, if only we could take people here with us, no one would say this is okay. So really excited to be starting with animal equality. The first event we were taking iAnimal to in the UK was Brighton Veg Fest. And it's about a 6-hour drive from where I live. My husband and I driving there late at night, the night before, listening to Radio 4, as you do. And this program came on where they started talking about what's considered acceptable morally in our generation today that might in the future be frowned upon or seen as completely abhorrent. So the question that the presenter asked was exactly this: what attitudes and practices that we accept as just part of the necessary arrangement of the world will seem horrific to the future? And of course, my husband and I looked at each other and went, oh, eating meat, ha, ha, ha. And the presenter said, the first is mass cruelty to animals in the pursuit of food. And he is a meat eater. You know, he went on to say this in the program. And I think the final line in this quote from the program, that the way we treat animals, the way we force them to spend their lives in such confined and constrained conditions will seem to future generations as unspeakable as slavery seems to our generation. So what are the numbers of animals who are used in factory farms? This is specifically about the United States and the number of animals slaughtered there. But you can scale this down for pretty much any Western country. The pattern will remain the same. It's just the actual number. So in the UK, just over 1 billion farmed fish are slaughtered every year. Chickens, just under 1 billion. Turkeys, about 18 million. Pigs, 10 million. Ducks, about 12 million in the UK. And the vast majority of those animals are factory farmed. So for chickens, it's about 96% of them will be factory farmed, pigs 94%. So the numbers in whatever country you're in will outnumber every other animal being abused for every other purpose put together. But it isn't just about the numbers. I've seen Ingrid Newkirk has written recently that we shouldn't just be looking at animals as numbers and qualifying how or which species we choose to defend based on quantity. But with factory farmed animals, it is so much more than just the numbers, because it's not only the greatest number of animals who are suffering for any reason, but they are actually suffering more than any other animal. This article in The Guardian, again, you know, a philosopher, not an animal rights activist. We can now create animals where we can meet all of their physical needs to keep them alive, to produce meat or milk or eggs that we want to eat, without fulfilling even a single one of their behavioral or emotional needs. So we have at the same time created, as he says, the most successful animals in the world who are actually the most miserable animals who have ever existed. And to me, this is really the fundamental issue of factory farming. I mean, the numbers are unfathomable, but the suffering that each one of them endures really is just unimaginable. So, apart from fish, on land, the largest number of animals who are raised and killed for food and incarcerated in factory farms are broiler chickens. And at every stage of their life, they are treated just like goods, like products on a production line, rather than beings. So Animal Equality did a big investigation last year into meat chicken hatcheries, and you can see that they're incubated in industrial size incubators, millions and millions and millions of eggs, producing millions and millions and millions of chicks. that just get processed on conveyor lines as if they were t-shirts or trainers or refrigerators. The individuals being completely ignored, and any who are not perfect, not profitable, are discarded, just like damaged goods, with no consideration that these are actually sentient beings. And from there, they go into the industrial warehouses, and we're all used to seeing photographs like this. 20, 50, even 100,000 chickens crammed into one shed for 6 weeks, the only mercy being that their lives are that short. Now, in these 6 weeks, that litter that those birds are sitting on won't get changed. So when you go into the sheds at the very beginning of the phase, when the chicks are really tiny, all the feeders and drinkers are down here. But they're all on a pulley system. So as the birds get bigger and the feces pile underneath them rises, they just raise the water troughs and the feeders on the pulley system, so they just get higher and higher. And the birds just sit in their own feces for 6 weeks. So when you go in there as a person, the first thing that hits you is the smell. It's a combination of ammonia and heat, because they keep the shed so warm. So it's like a sweet ammonia smell that literally hits the back of your throat and your nostrils and makes you gag. And these birds are breathing that in 24 hours a day. But they're also sitting in this ammonia-soaked litter, and of course it's very acidic. So hawk burns, which is on the very back of their legs when they're sitting on the ground, and the pads of their feet, even their chests, because they get so big they can't keep their own weight on their legs, so they lay down all the time. They'll get hawk burns on their chest. And you can clearly see this sometimes in the supermarket. So the top photo was a picture that went viral on Twitter. That's from a UK supermarket, the cooperative supermarket, which is meant to be a more ethical supermarket, and the hawk burns very clearly visible on that poor chicken's legs. So in addition to the conditions that we keep chickens in, of course, we have genetically manipulated them through selective breeding over generations and generations to be completely different from what a wild jungle fowl, their ancestor, would be. So even in the last 50, 60 years, we've turned them into these genetic freaks that just get so big so quickly, their legs and their joints and their hearts and their lungs simply can't cope with this huge weight. And when you go into the sheds, even very early on, you find birds that are completely off their legs and lame. I mean, this bird's only about 3 weeks old. And already, when you walk through the sheds, they're hardly able to move. It's such effort for them to get up that you do tend to have to tiptoe around in there, because they're just not going to move to get out of your way. It's too much effort. It's painful for them to walk. You know, birds that just literally sit on that acidic soil all day and all night, day after day after day. And by the end, many of them are completely lame, and once they flip over, they can't right themselves again. And this poor bird was struggling on his or her back, flapping and flapping and flapping to try and turn himself over again. Obviously, after taking the photograph, I turned him back over, and there were just huge sores, massive open wounds on the back of his wings from where he'd been struggling, battering his wings against the acidic floor. Some have their legs completely splayed out in front of them. I mean, a bird's legs should not do that. They're never going to be able to get up. They can't get up, it means they can't feed, it means they can't drink. So literally, for the last week of their life, they are slowly dying in the sheds. And they die at every stage. So in the hatchery, if they're not the right size, the weight, if they're not going to survive being shipped out to the farms, they go in the bin. If they didn't come out of the egg properly, they go in the bin. This is 1 week after being in the shed. The first week we went in there, the birds were 1 week old. This is a skip full of chicks who have died inside the shed. Uh-oh. Aha. You know, by the end, when you walk through the sheds, there are just dead, rotting carcasses littering the insides of these sheds. And this is the result on one farm after one cycle of chickens, overflowing bins. So the average mortality rate on a British chicken farm is about 5%. And you multiply that by the number of chickens who are farmed every year, that's 50 billion animals who are simply thrown in the trash on the farms every year, don't even make it to the slaughterhouse. But their lives are considered so worthless that it's actually more profitable to throw away 50 million animals than to improve the conditions that they live in. So 50 million thrown away. Again, it's unfathomable, this number. But each one of those 50 million is an individual. And this is one that we found on this chicken farm, alive, thrown in the bin. Probably in that bin for a good day and a half, based on where it was. It wasn't the very front bin, it was one bin back we had to open to find her in there. So she'd been in there at least a day and a half. Still alive, as soon as we opened the lid, chirping away, desperate to be alive. And she's still alive, amazingly. We took her home, brought her to a sanctuary, and that's what a healthy chicken looks like after a month outside of a factory farm. You know, they are still chickens. They can still be chickens if they're given the opportunity to be. An aspect that's quite often, well, most people don't know about, is how the breeders live for the broiler industry. This is a broiler breeder farm. So the conditions that they live in are very similar. Huge windowless sheds. They never go out, never see daylight, never smell fresh air. But there's an added insult for the broiler breeders. So they have exactly the same appetite as their progeny. They have been genetically selected for generations to put on weight very quickly, to eat and eat and eat. But as we see with the broiler chickens being raised for meat, that's not healthy. They are not healthy animals when they have access to food all the time and are able to put on as much weight as they like. For the breeders, they restrict their feed because they want them to last. A breeder will last maybe a year and a half. But they only do that because they limit the amount of food they have. So here you have birds who have been designed to put on weight, to constantly be hungry and want to eat. Yet some of them are on a once every other day feeding regime. So they are literally starving all of the time. They're always hungry. Also in the wild or with free-range chickens, they spend half of their time foraging. You know, that is what most animals spend their time doing in the wild. So these birds are just incredibly bored in these sheds, if nothing else. They also amputate the innermost toe on the breeding males so that when he mounts the female for mating, he doesn't accidentally scratch her, because obviously when you're sitting on your own feces for 6 weeks or longer, that will get infected very easily. So in order to prevent any sort of scratches or cuts, they cut off the innermost toe on the males, obviously when they're chicks. But apart from the pain they endure while the mutilation is happening, in the end of that amputated limb, neuromas can form. And I'm going to come back to this later when I talk about pigs' tails. But basically, neuromas happen where an amputation has taken place and the nerves keep growing, the nerve ganglia keep growing, but there's nowhere for them to go because the limb has been severed. So they end up growing into a big knot at the end of that limb. And in humans, that's what causes phantom limb pain. So it's safe to assume that it will have exactly the same effect in other species. So these males, many of them, will be in chronic pain for the rest of their lives from that amputation. The same thing is thought to happen in chickens' beaks when they're debeaked inside laying hen farms as well. So in the European Union, we've banned broiler cages. Isn't that an amazing step forward? Well, these are chickens in a cage in the UK. The industry does like to refer to them as colony lays or enriched cages, but for all intents and purposes, they are exactly the same as a battery cage. Instead of 6 or 8 birds per unit, here you have 80 birds in one larger cage, which leads to its own problems, because now you have 80 hens who are trying to establish a pecking order, which is natural hen behavior. That is what they do, but they can't escape. You know, the weaker ones, the ones sort of at the bottom of the pecking order, can't escape. They also have perches installed in them, which are meant to be a welfare enrichment. But many birds inside these colony cages actually die by getting stuck under the perches. And when you go into the farms, you know, you will invariably find dozens of hens dead underneath the perches. In other countries, they do still have battery cages where birds are crammed in there with about a postcard-sized space for each bird. All of them, whichever type of cage they're on, are spending their entire lives standing on a wire mesh floor. Now, their feet are incredibly sensitive. If you've ever watched a rescued hen scratching for food, you know, they are very tactile and they're very sensitive. So just spending your life standing on a wire mesh floor must be agony. And their claws often grow through the grates, and then they can't move, and then they can't reach the feed and water, and they die in the cages. They also undergo debeaking, because in those cramped conditions, pecking is very common. And of course, the male chicks will never produce eggs, so they're either macerated very soon after birth or gassed. Now, pigs also endure very severe confinement, the female pigs, the breeding pigs, and it's all around their breeding, and it's in 2 different phases. So the first time that they're confined is when they're impregnated, and then they go into the gestation crate, or in the UK we call this the sow stall. So when they're pregnant, they're in stalls like this, sort of lined up, you know, one right next to each other. When they give birth, they go into a different cage called the Farrowing crate. The gestation crate is still legal in the EU. Many people think it has been banned, but it's actually still legal for the first 4 weeks of pregnancies. Sows can still be locked inside these crates at the beginning of their pregnancies. In the UK, it's meant to be completely banned. We took these photographs in a UK farm in February, almost 20 years after these crates were meant to be banned, and they were still in them. I know that the Swedish activists have taken photographs in farms in Sweden, and they've found sows inside cages that are meant to be banned in Sweden. In the UK, we have on average about 1 inspection in a farm every 5 years. So, and that's announced. So really, you know, the laws mean nothing because it's impossible to enforce them. Again, some states in the US have banned them, Canada, New Zealand also phasing them out. But in many parts of the world, you think half of the pork production in the world is from China, where they're still used. So they will be locked inside these cages where they literally cannot move for 4 months for their entire pregnancy. And when the pregnancy is over, they don't get released, they go into this cage. And now this cage, the Farrowing crate, is still perfectly legal in the UK, and in most of the world. There's only 3 countries that have banned it, which are Sweden, Norway, and Switzerland. But again, Swedish activists have found sows confined inside of Farrowing crates. So she'll go in there about a week before she gives birth. The one on the right is pregnant, she hasn't given birth yet. And they'll stay in there for about 4 weeks until their piglets are taken away from them. I mean, that's much, much younger than piglets would naturally wean. They should really stay suckling for about 16 weeks, but that's not profitable, so we'll take them away at 4 weeks. Then the mother will be re-impregnated, and if she's in a country where gestation crates are still legal, she'll go from this crate back into the gestation crate, and she will go through that cycle for about 3 or 4 years until her body's just completely spent, and then she'll go to slaughter. In the UK, when they come out of farrowing crates, they're meant to be re-impregnated and put into group pens, which have their own problems, which I'll talk about in a minute. But these crates deny all maternal behaviors. All that she can do is lay there and suckle her piglets. And if a piglet can't reach her teats, ends up on the wrong side of her, is ill in any way, she is completely helpless to nurture that piglet. And she just has to lay there and literally watch them die in front of her. And I have been inside farms where the piglets have been dying in the front part of the cage, so the mother sow has to lie there and watch it happen for however long it takes for that poor piglet to die. So yeah, banned in a few countries. So this prolonged confinement leads to very obvious physical suffering. So this sow has very obvious wounds on her snout where she's clearly been trying to nuzzle under the bars to reach her piglets over and over again. It's just rubbed raw. This sow, now this is really common. Any farrowing unit you go into, you will see sows with just huge pressure sores on their side. She's a big girl, and she's laying on her side for a month at a time. You know, the pressure sores are inevitable. But the mental suffering, when you go inside a farrowing unit, you look into the eyes of these sows who are locked in cages, and you just know that they're broken. They are completely broken animals. They've really just given up any hope of having a life or being able to nurture their babies. So move to fattening units at 4 weeks, the piglets, when they're taken away. The ones in these photographs are a bit older. They tend to, at first, go onto plastic slatted floors and then move on to these wooden slatted floors when they're a little bit bigger. So always overcrowded, always barren. These dangly things from the ceiling are considered enrichment, because under EU law, they do now have to provide enrichment for pigs when they're in the fattening phase. The law, at least, well, the EU law does actually state that they're meant to give them suitable enrichment materials such as straw, hay, or a compostable material that they can root in. But most farmers get around that by saying, well, that's going to clog up my slatted floor if I put any of that stuff down. So just having a piece of string with wood on it is considered acceptable if you have a slatted floor, and it would be too inconvenient to give them straw. Now, this happens to piglets who are born to outdoor sows as well. So I know we find all the time when we're talking to people in the UK and show them the iAnimal film about pigs, and they say, but, you know, I see the pigs in the fields. I see them in those little arcs when I'm driving down the motorway. Isn't that how all pigs are farmed? I mean, in the UK, that's about 30% of the sows will be outdoors in those arcs instead of in the farrowing crates. But 99% of her piglets will be taken away at 4 weeks old and reared like this. The vast majority of piglets are reared indoors. Very, very few pigs are actually outdoors from birth until death. And in the UK, the statistic is 96% of piglets are reared like this. So no suitable enrichment. And something else I really only just thought about this year. We went into this farm here, and it was absolutely filthy, and everything was caked with this liquid gruel. And then the feed machines went on while we were filming, and we saw the troughs filling up. And then I researched them afterwards, and they are being fed exactly that, liquid gruel. I mean, if you think of a pig's natural behavior, what is that snout? What did that snout evolve for? It's for truffling and rooting all day long, and they don't have any of that natural behavior satisfied, even in their diet. Liquid gruel. I mean, you couldn't think of a more unnatural way to feed a pig. So this is a sow who's come out of her farrowing crate, been re-impregnated, and put into a group housing pen for pregnant sows. So this is meant to be the improvement on putting them into a gestation crate. I mean, clearly, she can at least walk around, but those marks down her side are all bite marks from other sows, because look at how crowded they are in that pen, and there's absolutely no enrichment again. So there's no point in just banning the gestation crate and forcing group housing if the group housing is inadequate. This is just leading to aggression between the sows. I mean, you know, to add insult to injury, she's still got her big pressure sore as well from being inside the crate. These piglets, every single piglet in that pen had chewed ears, and they didn't even have the so-called enrichment of a ball on a chain or a piece of wood. You know, it was a completely barren pen. And these are incredibly exploratory animals. The urge to explore is so fundamental to being a pig that to leave them in these barren pens really is just criminal. The industry's answer is to produce anti-cannibalism spray to stop them chewing each other, because clearly that must be cheaper than just giving them more space and some straw, or they wouldn't do it. Piglets also undergo multiple mutilations, so we're all quite familiar with the idea that laying hens are debeaked. Piglets will all have their eye teeth clipped or ground down within the first week of life, because they force sows to have far more piglets than she would do naturally. So they're all fighting for access to the teats. And she can't move away. Clearly, she's pinned to the floor. So they clip off the ends of the piglet's eye teeth to try and prevent damage to her teats. Males will be castrated. Not in the UK. They slaughter male pigs at a younger age than in some other countries, but in most of the world, males are castrated. I mean, this is all without anesthetic, of course, because that would cost the farmer money. And they do that to prevent the meat getting a gamey taste. It's called boar taint. So if the male is actually allowed to mature to 6 months with his testicles, the testosterone he produces will change the flavor of the meat. So, routinely castrated without anesthetic. And that's actually recognized now in the EU as being extremely painful. So some countries are now mandating some form of anesthetic. But like with anything, the amount of anesthetic needs to be right, you need to put it in the right place, and then you need to perform the operation quickly before it wears off. And I'm afraid in a farming environment, none of that is going to happen appropriately. And tail docking. Every pig I've ever seen on any farm in the UK has been tail docked. I mean, the EU Pigs Directive that says tail docking should now only be done as a last resort when there's ongoing problems of aggression and tail biting is such total nonsense. Certainly in the UK, I mean, it is not even as good as the paper it's written on, because it is not being enforced. Every pen you go into, barren pen, no straw, overcrowded, docked tails. It is... Yeah, well, it's not a joke. It's a tragedy. Again, done within the first week of life, no anesthetic. So I'm going to come back to neuromas. So in the end of that pig's tail, again, highly innervated. And I don't know why we need a professor of animal welfare to confirm this for us, but it's always useful when you have one. So acknowledging that a pig's tail is fully innervated and that tail docking can result in the formation of neuromas. And as we know, neuromas in amputated human limbs cause phantom limb pain. It is likely that a pig with a neuroma in its docked tail region will have frequent or continuous pain throughout his life. So it's not just the pain of having the tail cut without anesthetic, but for the next 6 weeks until they're sent to slaughter, the end of that tail is going to be painful. And just imagine when the tail biting continues, because it does, because they're in completely barren pens, you've now got this highly sensitive, oversensitive end of the tail being bitten. And scientists have shown as well, when they look at tails on slaughtered pigs, that indeed it's about 65% of pigs who have had their tails docked do have a neuroma on the end of their tail. So we're talking about 65% of the 10 million pigs we slaughter in the UK being in chronic pain from the time the tail is docked until they're slaughtered 6 months later. And at every stage they die. So the mortality rate of piglets before they reach weaning is about 12%, and that's just considered industry standard. They claim they use the farrowing crate, which constrains the sow, to prevent her from crushing her piglets. Obviously, in the wild, sows do not routinely crush their piglets. That would be a huge evolutionary flaw. The real reason that they confine them so constrictively is because it makes it easy for them to access her piglets. I mean, you have a 400-pound sow. She's not readily going to let you get in there and grab her piglets to cut their teeth off and cut their tails off and cut their testicles out. They have a very strong maternal instinct, and they're going to try and prevent the farmer from getting access to the piglets. So confining her in those crates makes it really easy for the farmer to just come in and grab the piglets and do what they like. Because studies show that in free farrowing systems where sows are not confined, They may crush a few more piglets, but far fewer piglets die from stillbirth or malnutrition because the mothers can actually perform some natural maternal behaviors. And they die in the sheds, of course they do. I mean, pig sheds are the most disgusting things in the world. The smell is beyond nauseating. I mean, you're like gagging and feeling like you want to pass out at the same time. It just hits you when you open the shed door of a pig farm, like a sauna, but in the worst possible sauna you could ever imagine, a sauna of feces. I mean, they're just festering places of disease. Of course they die. And the only way they keep animals alive here and in chicken farms in these disgusting, unnatural, overcrowded conditions is by using antibiotics. And then we know the problems that that leads to in humans with antibiotic resistance. And then I'm just quickly going to touch on fish farming because I've never been into a fish farm myself, so I can't speak from experience, but I do think with more than 1 billion fish being farmed in the UK, it is an area that we do need as activists to start looking into more. And this is a trout pond. As you can see, the principle is exactly the same, whether it's happening in the water or on land. These animals are overstocked in a very confined space. So you end up with problems of disease and parasites. Those are lice on the farmed fish. I actually think this was taken in a supermarket. You can try that the next time you're walking past the fresh fish counter. You will occasionally see the lice still on the fish in the shop. And this creates huge welfare problems. I mean, not just for the fish who are being confined inside the farm, but also when you have sea pens. So trout tend to be reared in pens on land. Salmon tend to be reared in sea pens, which are literally just nets in the sea that contain them. So the wild salmon migrate past these pens full of farmed salmon, and the lice transfer onto them as well. And certainly in British Columbia, Canada, they're having huge problems with declines of their native salmon species because, you know, in humans' infinite wisdom, they're farming Atlantic salmon in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of British Columbia, and the Pacific salmon are far more susceptible to the lice, so they're having huge lice burdens, and it's threatening the wild populations. Wild populations are also threatened by fish farming because most of the fish that we farm are carnivorous. So huge amounts of wild-caught fish are actually ground up and fed to fish on fish farms. And this is just, I mean, unbelievable. You wouldn't do this with mammals. We don't farm carnivorous mammals and feed them other mammals. You couldn't think of a less efficient way to produce food. And just like with chickens, we're producing complete genetic freaks. So the inbreeding generation after generation can lead to deformities in the farmed fish. But something unique to farm fish, because the pens are always open, these individuals are actually susceptible to predation, and they have no avenue for escape. So this fish has had a big bite taken out of him. And the solution to that is to try and kill every possible predator that comes in the area. So in England, well, Scotland actually, we have big sea pens of salmon, and they're massacring the seals in Scotland to try and protect their stock on the fish farms. Cormorants as well, so a bird that feeds on fish for trout ponds, really common. So they get these exceptional licenses because obviously cormorants are meant to be protected under the EU Birds Directive, but fish farmers can get an exemption to cull any cormorant that comes near their farm because they have the good sense to farm large quantities of a very desirable food item with no grate or even a net over the top of it. And it's the cormorants that pay the price. So I guess the moral of my talk really is that as animal advocates, I think we get a lot further by focusing on the cruel and unnatural nature of modern farming when we're talking to people about why they should stop eating animal products. Because I've heard this, if I've heard it, once, I've heard it 5,000 times when we've been out with the iAnimal. People are so completely shocked when they watch it. I mean, just completely blown away. We become blasé to it because we see this stuff all the time. But to the average person, this is really shocking. And they will say, oh, I don't have a problem with eating animals. Oh, I think I think humans have a right to eat animals. But they always say, but we don't have a right to treat them like that. So I think on that aspect of it, people are on our side. Nobody thinks it's okay to be cruel to animals. Well, I suppose a few people, but most people do not think it's okay to be cruel to animals. And that does include farmed animals. Blatant cruelty to farmed animals, they do think is wrong. So I think that if we go where we have the common ground and we show them how cruel this is, how unnatural this is, you might think humans evolved to eat meat, or we have the right to eat meat. But what we do to animals is so far removed from anything that has happened through evolution and anything that could be considered natural. And it's also a good avenue to then be able to explain to people that the current animal consumption in the Western world necessitates this kind of farming, because we get a lot of people who will then say, well, what about free-range organic? Surely I can just start buying free-range organic and all this cruelty will go away. But the amount of meat we eat, it is just not possible. You only produce that amount of meat by treating animals like industrial products that you produce on a factory line. So I think that if this is the line that we take and the focus that we have when we're talking to people, we're going to get to a vegan world more quickly than if we focus purely on the ethics of eating other species. Because ethics are very nebulous. You can argue about them all day long. It's hard to have a right or a wrong. But cruelty is cruelty. And when people see it with their own eyes, it's very hard for them to then walk away and look at that food in the supermarket and say, I am okay with that. So we can help you use this sort of information in your campaigning. Apparently after Jose, one of the international directors of animal equality, is going to be giving a talk next about our iAnimal project and using virtual reality to take people into factory farms. And then after that, the Bite Back stand is going to have a few of the headsets, I believe. So you'll be able to go in and try and see for yourself just how realistic the experience is. And then we are making this available to groups around the world to be able to use in their outreach, because we believe it is such a powerful tool for getting people to change their diet. So you can get in touch with us. And then we do regularly carry out investigations inside farms and slaughterhouses. So if you follow us on social media and share these with your friends and family and help people realize that what we do to animals in the name of food is far more twisted and cruel than every other form of animal abuse that they endure today. Thank you.
The presentation will be in room B, by the way, if somebody is interested in that. But who has questions and remarks?
Well, it's not really a question. I just wanted to add that when I talk to meat eaters, I only bring up examples from free-range organic, because usually those are equally cruel. Many times it's just a change of the feed that's organic, for example. So if you bring up the example of the free-range organic to begin with, then they don't have an escape route in the argument, and there's no way for them to say that I can just switch over.
We do undercover investigations as well with Manchester Pig Safe. We go in UK pig farms, but the ones we've been into, we feel like they breach a lot of legislations in them. We was wondering, how would we report it? Do we go to the newspapers, or how do we report the individual farms?
I mean, in the UK, you can report it to the Animal Health and Plant Laboratory, and also to trading standards. Trading standards actually are much more proactive than the Animal Health and Plant Laboratory, but you should report it to both. And then, yeah, your local media, if you can show that it is a local farm, then hopefully the local media would cover it. But also for outreach, because we find in the UK, we use footage from international farms or even farms from other parts of the UK, and people are kind of will say, oh well, I only buy my meat from my local butcher. So if it works really well when you have footage from that area that you can show and be like, no, this is actually 2 miles up the road from here, and people are really shocked by that. Everyone seems to think that cruelty only happens somewhere else, and their farms are rural idols.
Somebody else?
I actually have a question as well. The crushing of the piglets by the sow, what is the reason for that? Because obviously she doesn't want to hurt her own babies, but I have several people that they're arguing to me that they do it because they don't have as strong as a connection to their children, which I believe is completely false.
Wow.
But so what can I say to that? How can I defend that actually happens? Because obviously it's not her intention.
I'm sure they do accidentally crush them when they're not pinned to the floor, because they're big girls. So even in a free farrowing system on an indoor farm, so she won't be pinned to the floor, but she'll have maybe like from here to the end of the stage, it'll be a pen that big that she's in with her piglets. And of course, when she's been bred to have 18 piglets, when naturally she might have 8 in the wild, it's very hard for her to keep track of where they all are. So when she lays down, she may well accidentally crush a piglet. Whereas when they are free range in those arcs that they have outside with lots of straw to be able to make a proper nest, because they have a very strong maternal urge to build a nest when they're about to give birth, they crush very few piglets. So it's all a byproduct of the unnatural conditions they're living in and the unnaturally large litters that they're being forced to have.
Yes, I might have something to add, because it's kind of theory that like a pig farmer with like a less bad system had, but she had way less of this problem. And her theory was basically that because the muscles of the pigs are better developed because they can run around and walk, they don't, instead of like crush, they can actually lie down instead of just fall through their paws, basically. So. Yeah, maybe.
It's entirely possible, because when you see them in there trying to stand up, I mean, they really aren't very confident on their legs at all. And when they do go to lay down, it does look like they just get to a certain point and then gravity just takes over and they fall.
Well done. Thank you very much.
Thank you.